Hello, everyone out there. I see the words and your introductions are still coming in. I am so excited that you have joined us today. I am absolutely looking forward to this conversation. If you've joined us for any previous conversations, just know that I have my note paper ready and a pen so that I can jot down tons of notes during today's conversation. I know it's going to be a good one. This is our second installment of this year's Hard Conversation series, and we continue to interrogate the question, who deserves a shot at the American dream? We would like to start off with a huge thank you to our incredible sponsors, Charles Schwab Bank and Northway Christian Church, of our Hard Conversation series. Thank you for your investment in critical educational conversations that help us move closer to ending homelessness. As we go through our discussion today, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. You'll be putting that information, those questions, in the Q&A section, not in the chat. There's a Q&A section that you'll see down there at the bottom. Instead of clicking on chat, you'll see something for Q&A so that our team is able to field those questions. If time allows, we'll be able to answer a few of those questions. So really, really looking forward to that. To refresh your memory, last time we talked about how recent the phrase American dream is, that concept. It was coined by James Adams less than 100 years ago. Adams defines it as that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone. Dr. Martin Luther King later uses this idea to point out that this nation has consciously excluded certain people from that everyone. In our first discussion of the year, we explored how this conscious exclusion of Black people and other people of color from housing and other systems specifically caused so many problems we see today, and how we are here in Dallas and Collin counties. We must address these problems so everyone, not just some of us, may indeed have access to opportunities that lead to a better, fuller, richer life. For today's conversation, we center our whole discussion on the solution to homelessness, and that is housing. Full stop. Full stop. The solution to homelessness is housing. So I'm joined by two amazing authors, Gregg and Clayton. Please, if you would join me via your camera as I do your introduction. Gregg Colburn is an assistant professor at the University of Washington and co-chair of its Homelessness Research Initiative. He has published research on housing and homelessness in journals like Urban Studies, Housing Studies, Urban Affairs Review, and Housing Policy Debate. Gregg holds a PhD and an MSW from the University of Minnesota and an MBA from Northwestern University. Prior to academia, he worked as an investment banker and private equity professional. Give a warm round of virtual applause to Gregg. And we have Clayton Page Aldern. He's a neuroscientist turned journalist and data scientist, a Rhodes Scholar. He holds 2 master's degrees in neuroscience and in public policy from the University of Oxford. His essays in data journalism have been published by The Atlantic, The Economist, Scientific American, Grist, Logic, Sierra, Crosscut, and many other outlets. He is also a research affiliate at the University of Washington. It is Gregg and Clayton's book that many of us have been following along and reading, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Thank you, Gregg and Clayton, for not only writing this important book, but for joining us today. So again, give both of these amazing authors a warm round of a virtual applause for joining us today for this hard conversation. And then I have a dear friend that I am so excited to be able to introduce to everyone. Many of you already know him, Mr. Mike Koprowski, if you could join us now. And he is our moderator for today. He is no stranger to Dallas and Collin County. Mike Koprowski is the National Low Income Housing Coalition's housing, what's the official title? There we go, let me get it right. National Low Income Housing Coalition's National Campaign Director. I think I got it. Before that, he was the executive director of Opportunity Dallas, promoting greater economic mobility by tackling concentrated poverty and segregation through housing policy. And prior to that, he was the Chief of Transformation and Innovation at Dallas ISD, leading school integration efforts. An Air Force veteran, he has served as the Chief of Intelligence for an F-15E fighter squadron, and he holds degrees from the University of Notre Dame, Duke University, and Howard University. Mike, my friend, thank you for joining us today virtually, and I can think of no better person to moderate this vital discussion. Mike, Gregg, Clayton, you all have a great one.
Cool.
Thanks, Jolie.
Thanks, Jolie. Appreciate it. Yeah, hey everybody, it's good to be back in Dallas virtually, and it's really cool to see Jolie in this new role. Jolie and I were close allies in the work that I did in the school district, and then later on housing policy. So there's nobody better to do this change making work than Jolie. So Gregg and Clayton, it's good to have you here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'll just start off by saying, I mean, this book that you all wrote is one of the most influential. I guess my Zoom camera isn't honing in on it, but you all know what the book looks like. It really, I commend you guys. I mean, this is one of the most influential books written in this sector in a while. I work in this sector. There's a lot of buzz around this book. I can't remember this much buzz really since probably Richard Rothstein's Color of Law book came out. I mean, this is, in my humble opinion, this is the most talked about book since that book. So kudos to you guys for making such a contribution to the field. So let's just I'll start with I guess a softball question, which is what prompted you all to write this?
Well, thanks, Mike. We really appreciate the opportunity. I moved to Seattle in 2017 to begin my career at the University of Washington, and quickly got involved in a lot of conversations around housing and homelessness. And for those of you in Dallas who haven't made it to the Pacific Northwest recently, we have a major problem with homelessness in our community. And it's visible and apparent if you live and work in this community. And so it's top of mind. And every meeting that I left, I kind of would scratch my head and say, I don't think we really understand what the core driver of this problem is. And as a result, we had what I would describe as a pretty scattershot response. And it was a well-intentioned response. And so I'm not criticizing that. But what I left by saying is that unless we really understand the root cause of this, I worried that we were not going to make any progress. And to date, we really haven't. The problem just keeps getting worse. And so, there was information and data and analysis in the academic world that drew a pretty convincing link between housing market conditions and homelessness. But that information really didn't escape kind of the echo chamber of academia. And so I had decided to write a book that would, in essence, translate what we knew about the relationship between housing markets and homelessness for a general audience of people who are just interested and want to understand, why do we have such a problem here? What's going on? Policymakers who aren't experts on housing policy saying, what can we do here? And in the process of conversations with colleagues and friends in the Seattle region, I was introduced to Clayton, and we had good productive conversations. And I just said, hey, why don't we collaborate on this? Because I think his skill sets were a great complement to mine. And I'm really pleased with the book. I appreciate the kind words about it, Mike. And as I wrote in the preface, I think any a collaboration is successful if the end product is better than any person could have done individually. And I firmly believe that that's the case here. So anyway, that was kind of what motivated us and how Clay and I got together to work on this.
Cool. Yeah, and it's one of my favorite lines in the book. You all write that cognitive dissonance is real. Evidence doesn't always make a difference. That is true in this space, and it's probably true in the country writ large right now. Explain what you mean by that, particularly with a lens toward the issue that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Thanks for having us, Mike and Jolie, for these wonderful intros and including us today. I think it's a great question. I mean, what is cognitive dissonance? It's discomfort around contradiction, right? People believe what they want to believe, or rather, we're more likely to accept evidence that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs, and reject evidence and find a way of rationalizing our rejection.
Yeah, it's easier
when
it's easier that way.
Right? When that evidence doesn't mesh with our understanding of the world. Of course, it's easier that way. I mean, it's literally psychologically easier that way. That is one of the manners in which our brains are wired up to interact with evidence in the world, right? And we do, we see this all the time, especially in a hyper-partisan context like that of the United States. And we see it in climate change and gun control. We see it in homelessness, right? It's hard to change someone's mind on these topics because we are wired up to reinforce our own beliefs. So I think it's important to ground this conversation in this notion of cognitive dissonance, because the topic at hand, homelessness in the US, is tricky for a number of policy reasons, but it's also tricky for a number of psychological and communicative reasons.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. I remember talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago of like, and we work in the homelessness and housing sector, and he said, I was talking to this person and they're like totally, evidence-based and everything that we talk about, but then we get to the issue of homelessness and they just lose it. I don't know where they're coming from. So we'll try to get to the evidence base there. So let's kind of get more on that topic. So I want to kind of talk about the consequences of homelessness first before we get into causes, because we have to understand the impacts as well. So let's talk about the consequences both from an individual level and a societal level. And there's tangible consequences and there's intangible consequences. So why don't we start off by just talking about the individual consequences for people experiencing homelessness?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, right. If you talk to people experiencing homelessness, or if you read interviews with them or sociological studies based on these interviews, right, you tend to see the same consequences. I mean, first of all, homelessness can be really lonely, right?
Yeah.
Lonely because you might not be rooted in a community, or lonely because people with housing often start to stop seeing you as fully human, right? There's this like really profound psychological gap. So I think it's essential that we don't pathologize people who are sleeping outside just because they were late on rent. But sleeping outside all the time is rough, right? You have a lot less physical and psychological security. You're more likely to be the victim of an assault. You're more likely to have something stolen from you. You're more likely to develop a substance use issue, right? We'll come back to this later, but most people living with substance abuse issues come to these habits sleeping outside, right? As opposed to those habits resulting in their homelessness, right? Think about all the people with substance use issues who don't lose their housing. And likewise with serious mental illness, right? If you live with one of these conditions, you're drastically more likely to have it exacerbated if you're experiencing homelessness. It's harder to get a job after you've been homeless, right? It's harder to get a landlord to lease you an apartment. And you're also more likely to become chronically homeless, right? The best predictor we have of this chronic long-term homelessness is the length of time that you've been homeless, right? It's not age or race or anything like that, which is one of the reasons it's so important that people's bouts with homelessness, ought to be as brief as possible.
Yeah. And then these individual level consequences spill over into broader society. So explain some of those kind of broader structural costs that we face because of homelessness.
Yeah, this is, I spend a lot of my time talking to policymakers in our region. I was actually on the phone with a Seattle City Council member yesterday who was talking about this very point, which is, as a member of the city council, he gets the angry emails. Actually, Clay and I get some of them as well. When you write a book about homelessness, people come out of the woodwork and tell us how misguided we are and how poor our writing and research is. And so that's been an interesting experience. The vast majority of it has been positive, but we have gotten some on the other side. And I think policymakers in cities where homelessness is a big problem are getting this every day. And he just said, listen, I've got my finger on the pulse, and we've got a pretty progressive city politically that is tilting towards pretty harsh responses to homelessness because of the societal, the community level consequences and costs associated with homelessness. And I say to people, I'm a softie when it comes to homelessness, but when I'm walking around downtown with my kids and there's a guy taking the leak on the corner, I don't enjoy that. That's not something that I'm pleased that's happening in my city. And so I think there is a loss of community a loss of personal safety and comfort in our downtown region. That's clearly happening in Seattle. And it's hard to put a number on that. That would be one of those intangible costs. But in terms of tangible costs, the costs of homelessness are immense. I should say the costs of untreated homelessness are immense. When you look at the systems level costs related to emergency room, public safety, fire and police, streets and sanitation, library system, all of these systems that are essential to our community success are incredibly strained by homelessness. And in fact, my daughter is a basketball player, and one of her teammates, her dad is a Seattle firefighter. And he said that 75% of his calls are homelessness related in Seattle. Wow. He doesn't fight fires anymore. Yeah. He deals with homelessness. And so all of these costs are bubbling up, and it causes people to get angry, and there's fear, and that's prompting some pretty intense calls for harsher responses. And I fear that those will continue if we don't kind of bend the curve on the growth of homelessness in our region and in other regions around the country.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Greg, is the multi-sector impacts of homelessness, that this spills over into the criminal justice system, it spills over into the education system, the healthcare system, and there are tangible, quantifiable costs here. And just a quick little vignette here for Dallas folks. So when I was in the school district, we had our usual Monday morning cabinet meeting with the superintendent. And that particular morning, we were talking about student hypermobility. So kids that were changing schools very frequently throughout the school year, and what a challenge that was in terms of teaching and learning. And so here we're walks into any fourth grade classroom, everybody's going to be doing fractions at the same time. That'll solve the problem. Or maybe we do more professional development for teachers, or maybe we provide more supports to hypermobile kids. And really what was happening was a bunch of educators sitting around the table trying to figure out a problem that's rooted in the housing sector, right? And that could be true in the health sector, or the climate sector, or the criminal justice sector. And that's a message that we try to send a lot at the national level to our friends in other sectors, that you can't fully achieve your goals if the people that you serve don't have access to safe, decent, affordable housing. So I think the multi-sector impacts are really important, and no matter what sector you work in, you should be worried about this issue. So let's now talk causes. And there's the right focus and there's the wrong focus here when we talk about causes. So let's first start with what's the wrong focus, and that is these individual level causes. And I'll cite 2019, the President's Council on Economic Advisors stated that attributes that increase individuals' risk of homelessness drive a community's level of homelessness. What's wrong with that statement?
Yeah, so I'm gonna focus on the individual ones, and then for the more positive part of the story, turn it over to Clay in terms of what is a better predictor here. But what's complicated about this, and I want to be clear, and we try to be pretty clear in the book, that while we don't believe that these individual drivers explain regional variation, they are important. We're not going to dispute that poverty is a cause of homelessness. There is no doubt about that. If you are poor, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. And so what we have is, in the academy, we would call it a unit of analysis problem. And so when we study homelessness, we have to pick a unit of analysis. A lot of research focuses on the individual, right? And so it might be, why is Mike likely or not likely to experience homelessness? Or what are the odds that Mike will experience it? Or what is a good intervention that would help Mike if he's experiencing homelessness? And that's good and important work. And when you look at that literature, what you see is poverty, mental illness, drug use, domestic violence, other instability are risk factors for homelessness. We're not disputing that in any way. The problem is that I think that report from the Trump administration, as well as a lot of other people, I think if you were just walking around, they will say, well, if those are the individual drivers, then if I see a whole bunch of homeless people in the street, it must be that we just have a whole bunch of, quote, those people.
Right.
Okay. And what we demonstrate in the book is that is in fact not the case. And in fact, it's in many times the absolute opposite. Detroit is the most impoverished city in the country. Of the cities that we sample, the 30 biggest metros in the United States, it's the most impoverished, and it has 1/5 the homelessness of West Coast cities. Yeah. So, and that is a weird data point, right? Because we know that poverty causes homelessness, yet this huge, quantity of people living below the federal poverty line hasn't produced homelessness in Detroit. And so that's kind of a head scratcher. And so we spend a couple chapters going through those to say, while yes, they might be a driver at the individual level, they don't map to community level. There's something else going on. And that's where we transition into what we really believe the root cause to be.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue to Clayton. Let's talk through what the right sort of community level focus should be.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, listen, the book is this study in which we walk through a lot of these factors. We ask questions about to what extent a given factor like income or poverty or race can explain this regional variation that Gregg talked about, right? Is it necessarily true that there are just more people with extremely low incomes living in Seattle than there are in Chicago, for example? And the answer is no. So when we think about what does explain the story here, what explains the variation in question, the housing market really matters. Our study basically shows that the two most convincing factors, those that explain this regional variation in space and time, they're both related to the housing market. I mean, you can probably guess what they are, right? It's that higher median rents predict higher per capita homelessness, and lower rental vacancy rates, right? How many units are available to rent also predict higher per capita homelessness, right? In other words, tighter housing markets explain the difference between Chicago and Seattle or Detroit and Seattle. And you might say, oh, well, median rents are the right indicator because people who are experiencing homelessness, they aren't making the median income or renting at the median level. But these results, they hold if you look, way down the income spectrum as well. And I think the big takeaway is that the housing market at all levels is basically the strongest predictor we have.
Yeah, I mean, you write in the book that homelessness thrives amid affluence, not necessarily poverty, right? Talk more about that.
Well, we take readers on a bit of a historical journey at the beginning of the book, in the sense that homelessness came to the attention in the United States during the Great Depression. With Hoovervilles and in most of the metro areas in the United States, there was homelessness, and there was, while tragic, there was some intuition behind that, right? We had 25% unemployment, and people were losing their homes, and businesses were failing, and therefore we had homelessness, and so there was a logical link there. And when homelessness kind of pops back up in the American story in the 1980s, it was coming out of the late 70s, early 80s recession. And the writing at that time said, well, we had this recession, oil prices, interest rates crazy in the late 70s, kind of the Carter to Reagan transition. And the writing was, once the economy fixes itself or comes back, we'll be fine. This is kind of a transitive issue. Well, the economy comes back, it roars back, in fact, under Reagan in the 80s. And what happens? Homelessness doesn't go away. And so we enter the modern era, which is what we see. Homelessness is a big issue in booming economies, and in particular booming cities, right? The wealthiest cities in our country is where we have a problem. And so it is really incongruous. And it's walking around Seattle with tech millionaires all over the place, and then you're stepping over people. It is just a really troubling dichotomy in these cities. And the one other thing that I just want to add is, and I say this in all my public talks, is there are people with risk factors and vulnerabilities in every community in the country, every single one of them. The context in which those vulnerabilities occur determines whether you're going to have a problem with homelessness or not.
Yep.
That is the fundamental issue here. There are drug users, there are mentally ill people, there are people in poverty in Chicago, just like there are in Seattle. It's just, the reality is that when rents are $700 a month, you can figure it out. When they're $2,500 a month, it's a lot harder. It's a pretty simple story when you boil it down.
Yeah, you follow the rent.
Yep.
And you all said in the book that, homelessness is a result of how we construct and operate our cities. And so the Detroit example that you brought up earlier, just a few stats that I found pretty compelling, is you look at a place like San Francisco, where the poverty rate is 10%. In Detroit, it's 33%. If you look at unemployment rates in San Francisco, it's like 3%. They're basically at full employment. In Detroit, it's 20% unemployment. And yet in San Francisco, homelessness is 3 times higher than Detroit. Why? Because the median rent in San Francisco is $1,600 a month, and in Detroit it's $850 or something like that. So I think that's a really good way to look at it. And Dallas is somewhere in the middle there, between Detroit and San Francisco. So I think you all have well established that we have a problem of confusion in this country, that we're confusing individual level causes with city level causes. And I think some of the data points that we've talked about here can kind of help us address that. So let's talk, just to hammer this point home a little bit more, let's talk about more on the regional variation that we do see in homelessness. Talk about the regional variation a little bit more.
Well, so the sample in our book is the 30 largest metro areas in the country. And we break, and for those of you in the homeless world, homeless services and response world, you'll know what a continuum of care is. For those of you who don't, each jurisdiction in the country is covered, with a couple minor exceptions, by a continuum of care. And this is basically a geographic unit that allows for federal funding and dollars to flow into a particular community. And some COCs are mapped with the county. In Seattle, that would be the case, in Dallas as well, if I remember correctly. And so it'd be a county-based COC. So it includes both the city of Seattle and our surrounding suburbs. Other COCs are city only. And because homelessness is higher in cities than it is in suburban locations, we need to make sure when we compare rates of homelessness that we compare apples to apples. And so what we do in the book is we compare city-based COCs and look at variation. And then we look at county-based COCs and look at the variation. The county ones, all else equal, will be lower than cities because of the suburban dynamic. But what's really interesting is when you look at the variation in both of those columns, there's about a 5-to-1 ratio between the highest per capita rate of homelessness and the lowest. And that 5-to-1 relationship holds in both cities and counties. And so your question is about variation. There's massive variation across the country. It actually shocked me. I knew there was, but when I actually sat down and did the numbers and kind of the early cuts of this book, I was like, jeepers, there is a lot of variation here. And so ultimately, that's what we're trying to answer in the book is, why do we have this 5-to-1 relationship?
Yeah. And the two things that account for these variations are,
rents and vacancies, the availability, the accessibility of housing and its cost.
Yeah.
And sorry, Clay, I'll just finish this and hand it over to you. We also want to be really clear that homelessness is a really complex phenomenon. And so what we're saying here is the best predictors of regional variation are rents and vacancy rates. It is not the only predictor. It doesn't explain 100% of the variation. But when you look at the other things, they explain nothing.
Yeah.
Drugs don't explain anything. Poverty actually has a negative relationship. Mental illness doesn't explain anything. So this is the best we got. It's not a complete picture. This is a complex phenomenon. But by far, it's the most convincing explanation we find. Sorry, Clay, go for it.
Oh no, I was just going to say, in response to what you just said, Greg, and this quote you raised from the book earlier, Mike, that homelessness is a direct result of how we construct and operate our cities. I think these two ideas in conversation with one another. I mean, part of what that statement is getting at is that, right? Obviously, there's a link between housing policy and housing market decisions and downstream effects on homelessness, right? There's this great study by Albert Saiz that basically shows how responsive a given city's housing supply is to changes in population. And there are basically two factors that affect this responsiveness, right? Topography, which is like, do you have mountains and water? Because if so, you can't build on them. And policy, right? Like, how easy is it to build? And you can really only change the latter as a city. So if you accept the premise of our book that homelessness is a housing problem, then housing supply should matter. And our city's choices around how easy it is to build should really matter.
Yep. Yeah, and let's get into the policy conversation. But first, I just want to hit on the how structural racism fits into all of this. People of color are disproportionately likely to experience this homelessness. This did not happen by accident. So kind of talk us through how you all see structural racism fitting into all of this.
I mean, it's fundamental to the discussion, right? I mean, what it doesn't do is explain regional variation. And that's kind of the end of the story. I mean, we know that people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, are overrepresented in the population experiencing homelessness relative to their share of the general population, right? That's what you just said. It's also true that they're overrepresented relative to their share of the population in deep poverty, by the way. So this isn't just an income issue. Okay, so it's incontrovertibly true that you're more likely to lose your housing if you're Black. But in terms of the variance we're talking about, variance in per capita rates of homelessness, race is not a strong explanatory factor. And so what that means is that location, right, the housing market factors we just discussed, location exacerbates vulnerability. Right? The consequences in terms of homelessness risk of being Black are different in San Francisco and Seattle than they are in cities with more accommodating housing markets.
Yeah.
You know, and so in this sense, I think in terms of explaining regional variation, race works a lot like other individual factors. And of course, it's true that you're more likely to experience homelessness if you have an extremely low income. But it's also true that, you know, as Greg said, you can afford an apartment on a low income in Detroit, and you can't necessarily afford one in Seattle.
Right. Yeah.
And we've actually had some pushback when people say, well, you're saying that race doesn't matter. And we're saying, we're not saying that race doesn't matter. In fact, we're saying the opposite argument. But what's interesting is Seattle's a pretty white city, right? Detroit, St. Louis, and Chicago are not. They're far more diverse, far higher percentage of the Black population. They have far less homelessness. And so we have another situation where we know that Black people are overrepresented in the homeless population, yet in communities that have higher percentages of people who are Black and brown, they have lower rates of homelessness. Yeah. So what's the point here? To me, race helps explain who becomes homeless within a given community. And in a very white and Asian city, affluent city like Seattle, being Black or Indigenous is a huge risk factor because of all sorts of multiple systems interacting, whether that's the cultural system, the education system, healthcare system, labor markets, all those come together to produce risk for people who are Black and brown, especially in cities that are disproportionately white, like San Francisco and Seattle. And so again, it's kind of a complicated story, but and when you say systemic racism, that's fundamental because it is all these markers. You know, I teach housing classes at the University of Washington, and I'll say to students all the time that if you want to understand racial disadvantage in the United States, spend a semester studying the housing market.
Yeah.
It will tell you exactly why we have a huge wealth gap in the United States, why our schools are different, the way we fund is through property taxes. All of these issues come together to produce disadvantage. And so it shouldn't surprise us. It's tragic, but it shouldn't surprise us that we see this disproportionality among the most vulnerable in society, those experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, very well said, Greg. I think I always sort of try to frame it as, you know, in the fight for greater racial equity, housing is ground zero in that fight. It really is. So let's, we were talking about how we construct and operate our cities. So let's nerd out on the policy stuff, right? Because there's topography, which we can't change, and then there's policy, which we can very much change. And, you know, the housing policies that we have created in this country did not fall from the sky. They are man-made. We decided upon these things once upon a time. And so, you know, in the book, you highlight things like single-family zoning. And I think last time I was in Dallas and I looked at it, I think like 75% of the land is eaten up by single-family zoning. There's other land use restrictions that you all explain are pretty big culprits in housing insecurity and homelessness. So talk us through that. Sure.
Clay alluded to this in his prior comments, but the responsiveness of a housing market is really, really important. And I want to center Dallas in the conversation, given that that's where we're speaking today. You know, what we highlight in the book is that there are housing markets that are more accommodating, that build a lot of housing when population grows. And generally speaking, the Sun Belt has been very responsive, and they have accommodated population growth far better than Seattle, San Francisco, Boston have. And as a result, have not experienced, they certainly have housing pressures, housing market pressures, but not to the extreme that the coasts have. And part of that is it's easier to sprawl in Dallas than it is in Seattle because we have mountains and water. And that's an intuitive understanding, but it's also easier to build. It just is. Now, the regulations around housing construction in Seattle, and I hear this all the time from developers, drive everyone crazy. It can be a year or two to just get a permit to build a house when Rome is burning and we're going through a 2-year permitting process. And so I was on a call with the mayor recently, and the first questions a developer asked us, how are we going to get a permit? Like, he was yelling at the mayor, like, we have got to build more housing. Yeah. And so we can learn something from other communities where it is easier to build. And so that's essential. We also are zoned 70% single family in Seattle. Yeah. And we are growing by leaps and bounds. And unless we change the way that we construct our residential housing in Seattle, we just won't be able to accommodate. We can't put everyone who wants to move here and work for Amazon in 30% of the parcels. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Yeah. And so I think what's really surprised me when I looked at this was Charlotte, North Carolina has grown as fast. Their MSA has grown as fast as Seattle over the last 15 years. Booming metropolitan area. Yeah. Their housing unit production and growth has been stacked. It actually has outpaced their population growth, which is amazing. Oh. And so what you see is their housing production and their population growth has been doing this. And what we've seen in Seattle is this is our population growth and this has been our housing production. And that gap just keeps getting wider. And as that gap gets wider, it makes it harder for university professors to find housing and third grade teachers. And it makes it really hard if you're making $15 an hour. Impossible, basically. And so we've got to figure that out. And that's true all around the country. I think Austin is the canary in the coal mine for the Sun Belt. They are tipping over from a place that has been able to accommodate growth to the point where they're not keeping up anymore. And what you're going to see, and I think we're already seeing that based on what I read in the press, is they're going to start looking and feeling more like a West Coast city with unsheltered homelessness and much higher rates than what we've seen typically in the Sun Belt because they just have not been able to keep up.
Yeah. So, I mean, is the answer here to decommodify housing? Is that ultimately what we're looking at here is the solution? How do you all approach that?
Well, that's a good word that we should think about. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, that literally means we would be treating housing less like a commodity. Yeah. And I would say sign me up. But there are a lot of ways to make that happen. I think public housing is one of them, but it's not the only one. And public housing can look very, very different in different contexts. But right, like nonprofit housing is another. That'd be another means of thinking about an alternative to the private market, right? Like if a housing authority buys an old hotel and makes it available as long-term housing, that's decommodification. So I mean, I think the point is, and something that comes to mind as you raise that question, Mike, is that we know that the private market alone isn't solving the problem, and we shouldn't expect it to, right? The incentive structures of the private market aren't set up to provide all of the housing we need as a country. We already know that the profit motive alone doesn't work. Just look outside, right? And so, I think the suggestion here isn't that the private market isn't useful for some things in housing markets. I mean, it's really good at building market rate housing by definition, and we need that housing. I think our suggestion is just that other tools, public and nonprofit tools, are at our disposal as well, and we ought to be taking advantage of them.
Yeah. So this is the fundamental problem here is one of political will and resource commitment, right? And until we understand this issue as structural in nature, it's hard to get at that political will. It's hard to get at that resource commitment. So talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, this really gets to why I wanted to write this book. That if we continue to think about homelessness as an issue of personal failing or poor decision making, which I think if you were to poll the general populace, a lot of people would say that that's the case. We will never generate the political will that we need to make the investments that we need to make. And the real bummer about our book and the conclusions that we reach is that housing is expensive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why this, this narrative frightens people is it really forces us to look in the mirror and say, oh crap. So we have to construct hundreds of thousands of units in our region and millions of units around the country. And when affordable units are costing $500,000 a door in Seattle, and you start to multiply that by 15, 20, 25, 35,000 units, that's real money.
Yeah.
And that's daunting. And when you see LA raising $1 billion of public finance and it's like spitting into the ocean, given the scale of the problem, people say, oh, this is, and I say, this is not a hundreds of millions of dollars of problem. This is a tens of billions of dollars of problem in our region, not even speaking locally. And so we have to link the structural driver of the crisis to a structural solution. And that's tricky. And as long as we are walking down the street pointing at Joe and just saying, look at all the poor decisions Joe has made, that will never lead towards people's political action, either through the, at the voting booth or the elected leaders that they elect, won't then say we need to prioritize housing, because I don't think housing helps Joe, right?
Yeah.
And that's the cognitive dissonance that's a real problem here and a major impediment. And so that's why I think without a change in the way we think about homelessness, I really fear that we won't marshal the resources we need to put a dent in this thing.
Yeah. And I assume that you are talking about action at all three levels of government here, right? That the scale of the problem is such that the federal government in particular requires a robust response. That you talked about pennies in the ocean, or can this be done without robust federal involvement? I guess is my question. Can we do this without the federal government?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to do it without the feds. And I was on a panel with the county exec for King County, and King County is the county that Seattle's in. And I just said, I think that the federal government has done a huge disservice to state, local political leaders, in the sense that they have divorced themselves from low-income housing policy, not completely, but largely speaking. 1 out of 5 people who are eligible for housing support from the federal government get it.
Yep.
For the 4 and 5 who don't get support, they are now looking to states and local jurisdictions and saying, hey, I need help here. And given that this is the biggest component of the household budget, we're now pushing that huge obligation on jurisdictions that don't have anywhere near the financial means that the federal government does.
Not even close. Yeah.
And so now what happens is every time we have a mayor being elected in Seattle, they say, what are you going to do about homelessness? And so then that person fails and gets voted out of office, and we get someone else. And it's very hard for a local mayor to say, well, you can't blame me because the federal government hasn't been involved in 40 years. It's not great politics, right? And so we end up with this really difficult situation. And so, and given the way things are going in DC, I'm frankly not hopeful that we're going to see a 2, 3, 4x increase in support for housing support. And so as a result, can we solve it at the state and local level? Probably not. But as we write in the book, the reality is the state of Washington is incredibly wealthy. And we have we have a more regressive tax system than Texas does, which I know surprises a lot. We don't have a state income tax either. And we rely very heavy on excise taxes, sales taxes, et cetera. A pretty modest state income tax here would generate tens of billions of dollars that we could use to support housing. And so we're not powerless, even if DC doesn't act. It would make it a heck of a lot easier if DC did act. But I think we do also have to recognize that, Texas, Washington, there's a lot of resources in these states. And when you start to aggregate them across huge populations, you can generate tens of billions of dollars without, a major inconvenience. And so I would love for the feds to act, but if they don't, we got to figure it out, because the current trajectory is incredibly problematic.
Yeah, I think, we talk about it at sort of the federal level of when you trace out the federal government's investments in affordable housing programs, it has hemorrhaged over the past 40 years. If you looked at a line graph, you would see basically in the 80s, the HUD budget was cut in half, and we've never really recovered from that slash. And the consequences are laid bare. as the rental market just keeps going up and up and up, and it's really problematic. So the point that I always try to make people is you know, I was sort of in a position where in Dallas I was kind of a local advocate and tried to push on you know, city council members to improve the local housing policy. But I think it's equally important for folks at the local level to engage their federal delegation as well, to talk to their House of Representatives, to talk to their senators, and really express the need for federal involvement in this situation as well. Because we, like you said, Greg, the problem is so big that you need local government to act, you need state government to act, and you need federal government to all be rowing in the same direction if we're really going to solve this problem.
Absolutely.
So you all argue in the book, and I really like the way that you frame this: inflow, crisis response, outflow. And you argue that to end homelessness, we have to focus on these three things: inflow, crisis response, and outflow. Kind of explain what you mean by each of those, and why we have to really focus on all three of those.
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, I think what we're arguing is that cities and counties' responses to homelessness can be thought of as systems, right? And that's kind of a fuzzy word that doesn't really mean anything, but I'm using it right now to mean you know, something with interrelated stages, right? Something that consists of relationships.
Yeah.
And the homelessness system, as it commonly takes its form in cities and counties, consists of a couple stages and the relationships between them, right? There's inflow into the system, there's the crisis response itself, and then there's outflow from the system. You know, so inflow is everyone who's losing their housing, right? If you lose your housing and bump up against a shelter, you're part of inflow. And then there's the crisis response itself. So this is you know, coordinated entry programs, shelters, rapid rehousing programs, permanent supportive housing. This is probably what you're thinking of when you think of a homelessness system. But that's not the whole story, right? There's also the outflow, and that's basically the housing, because you know, we don't want people to just cycle through a system forever. So I think the point is we need to focus on all three stages if we want to solve the problem. You know, we work on inflow when we focus on homelessness prevention, you know, or tenants' rights, eviction prevention. We work on the crisis response when we improve shelter capacity, you know, or improve the efficiency of the system and make sure people are moving through it as quickly as possible and having their needs met. And I mean, you know, we work on outflow when we build more housing. But I think that link is important, right? If people don't have a unit to move into, a crisis response system doesn't really matter, or at least the improvements you make to it don't result in a good outcome for someone. I mean, think about rapid rehousing, for example, right? So this is a program in which you subsidize in a means tested manner someone's rent for, you know, 6 or 10 months. They lose their housing, they're experiencing homelessness, they come through a coordinated entry program, and then you know, the COC that Greg mentioned, the continuum of care, ensures that this person is leasing an apartment and their rent is subsidized for, you know, half a year or a year. The goal during that time is that they're getting back on their feet, they're raising their incomes, and ultimately retaining the lease on that apartment at the end of the subsidy period. That is a lot easier to do in like Salt Lake City than it is in San Francisco, right? It may be the case that in both cases, people are raising their incomes over that subsidy period, but then the subsidy ends, and in Salt Lake City, no problem, you've brought your income up enough to retain that lease. In San Francisco, you're being thrown to the dogs. And so, you know, thinking about these interrelated pieces as a system, as opposed to you know, distinct areas in which we somehow make unrelated improvements, I think the systems approach is the way to go. And ultimately, we do need to work on all three chunks if we're going to make substantive progress. Yeah,
I think that's really well said, Clayton. So what do you all say to the pessimists? Because what we're essentially talking about here is a paradigm shift, right? And it sounds daunting, and I've certainly had that experience. I'm sure you all have as well, where you're at the Thanksgiving table, and you know, your skeptical uncle says, really, you're going to end homelessness? But we actually have a pretty decent proof point here, which is veteran homelessness. The political will around veterans homelessness is much more robust than homelessness generally. And so there's a potential proof point there that we've actually put a significant dent in veteran homelessness. And I think it's very instructive. So talk through what do we say to the pessimists, and sort of what proof points can we show them that this is actually possible to end homelessness?
Yeah, those are all good questions. I would say that well, we get a lot of questions when we're out on the road, but one of the most common ones is, well, Greg, what's an example of a city that has done this and been successful? And I'll say there isn't one.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reality is there is not an expensive city with scarce housing that has made a major investment in housing production, therefore ended it. And so they'll say, well, then why do you feel confident that your story holds, right? We don't have an example to cite. And that's a fair critique. I wish we did have an example. We don't. And I'll say, I think the evidence is more than clear that if we don't do that, where we're going to end up. And that's where we are right now. Right. Yeah. And I think, and I always bring up veteran homelessness because ultimately what we did, leaders of both political parties said, we don't think people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan should be homeless. We don't want to repeat the Vietnam era, right? Where generally it was guys in that case coming back and had experienced terrible lives, right? And so with the resources and the political will, what did we do? We gave them housing. And what happened? Yep. We cut veteran homelessness by 50% in 10 years. Yep. And so I can't give you a city that's done it, but I can tell you when we gave housing to veterans who have many vulnerabilities in terms of addiction and PTSD, sure, mental illness and poverty and all sorts of issues, we cut it by 50%. And so to me, that's the shining example that we have in our nation of demonstrating the link between housing and homelessness, not in a negative way, but in a positive way.
Yep, and it's really a matter of extending the political will that we found around veterans homelessness. To me, the fundamental question for advocates is, how do you take that political will that we found on veterans homelessness and apply it to homelessness more broadly? So let's get into the kind of the advocacy piece, which is, you know, what type of advocacy or action can those of us who are, you know, those who are listening to this conversation, what can they take to sort of change the current state of homelessness and housing?
I'm happy to take a swing at this, and I'd be curious to hear Gregg's thoughts too. I mean, I would just say you can say yes, right? I'm sure you've heard of NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard. We need more YIMBYs, people who are saying yes, right? We need people who are excited about density and potentially excited about decommodification. We need people talking to city councils about structural change, right? Advocating for investments in housing as opposed to encampment sweeps, right? There's occasionally this policy in Seattle in which, you know, encampments are just moved around the city, and that doesn't solve the problem. It relocates the problem. So you know, what can people do? I mean, money helps. Money always helps, right? If you're giving to a local shelter or a local houser, that matters. It does matter. You know, I go back to cognitive dissonance a little bit, I guess. We need more people talking to friends and family, right? You know, what is one of the cures for cognitive dissonance, right? Like having a discussion with somebody who trusts you. So like arguing with strangers on the internet, probably like not the best mode of engagement, but like having a good conversation with that uncle in question, like that's useful. Thinking about the root causes of the issue with people who might disagree with you, but with whom you're close. You know, that really matters too. Greg, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. I think to a certain extent, I will say in my own personal experience, I have, my pendulum has swung back and forth from focusing on supporting individual organizations and people to really focusing on the structural, how are we going to end this whole thing? And I think, you know, Mike, as someone who's probably more on the structural side right now, thinking from a federal level, how do we end this? That can be very difficult work. And at times really depressing when you look at the scale of the problem and the lack of progress that we're making. So I have a dear friend here in Seattle who has been involved in this work for 40 years. He just retired, and he basically said, I can't do this anymore. And what is he doing? He went to go work with a small nonprofit, and he said, if I can improve one person's life, I'm going to do that. I'm going to feel better about that. And so I would never tell someone that you need to be focused on the structural, or you should, or you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't give $50 to a food bank. Absolutely, do what is right for you. And I think in our lifetimes, I've certainly swung back and forth, and that's totally fine. I think the engagement is the really important thing. And I think, I use every opportunity that I have to tell this story. And one of the weird things, I've got a weird background because I was an investment banker and now I study homelessness. And so one of the vestiges of my past is I play golf, which I don't tell professors, because I hate golfers. But I get 4 hours with people on the golf course. And you would not believe the conversations that I've had with people who have in the bar afterwards said, Greg, I've really changed the way I'm thinking about homelessness as a result of our conversation. And I take that as a win. And that's a real small win when you think about one person, two people, three people. But we all have a role to play. And I think Clay and I, hopefully by writing a book and having conversations, can play a small role. Mike, through your advocacy work at a national level, can play a role. Everyone on this call, by either how you vote matters, who you vote for matters, what you advocate for, where you invest your charitable dollars. All these things matter. And so we can all make an impact. And I gave a talk at Lakeside School, which is a kind of an elite school here in Seattle where Bill Gates went. And I gave their economics lecture, and a student asked this question. And I just said, get involved. And that can be in a variety of different ways, but apathy is the enemy of progress. And the great thing about homelessness is people care. The problem with climate change is people like, I don't know what to do. Should I buy a different car? Should I recycle? I won't water my lawn. Like it almost seems so overwhelming. Whereas, and so we end up with apathy, and that's a huge problem. We don't have apathy. People are pissed off and angry about homelessness, and we can channel that passion towards solutions. And so we have a huge advantage in this fight because people are engaged, and we have to figure out then how to channel that into action.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I agree with everything you guys said. I'll add one additional thing that I've sort of come across in my advocacy that I think has mattered and made a difference, and that is multi-sector advocacy. Is bringing in folks from outside the housing and homelessness space to stand shoulder to shoulder with you while you do the engagement, while you do the advocacy. For example, when we walk into a congressional office, we always make sure to bring, somebody from the healthcare space, somebody from the education space, somebody from the criminal justice space, the climate space, and say, we need action on housing. When we send a sign-on letter up to Congress and it says, we need X billion more for housing choice vouchers. If it's signed by a bunch of housing organizations, well, the policymaker looks at it and says, well, no surprise there, the housing organizations want more housing resources. But when it's signed by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the NAACP and the Food Research and Action Center and all of these groups who are saying, yeah, we work in other sectors, but we can't accomplish our goals if people are not adequately housed. It makes a difference for policymakers. So I would urge, I assume that most folks on the call work in this space, but really part of that engagement is folks who specialize in other areas. When you have a teacher who's looking a policymaker in the eye and saying, my job as a teacher is so much harder because of our housing policies in this city, or a doctor, a pediatrician who says, I have kids who are coming into my office, and the prescription I really want to write for them is one that they don't stock at Walgreens, and that is a safe, decent, affordable housing. And that just has a tremendous impact. So I would really urge folks in the housing space to do that work and engage folks that might be running in different circles than you are. So one of my pet peeves is when a moderator doesn't leave time for audience Q&A. So I've tried to avoid that. I think we have 25 minutes, and I know that we have a couple questions that were in the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it back over, and we'll farm out those Q&As, and yeah, we'll go from there.
This is fantastic conversation. I'm going to lift up the notes that I have. And then David will facilitate some of those questions and really Mike, Greg, Clayton, either one of you, please don't hesitate to kind of lean in on those questions. To Mike's point, that multi-sector approach, it goes back to an earlier statement about the multi-sector impact and cost associated to the issue of homelessness. So the solve is also in that multi-sector approach. The other one that really, I love the thread of conversation is around political will and resource commitment, the need for both of those in this space. And often it's very difficult to get both, but that is something I wrote down as well. Advocating for structural changes, right? What can we do? Get involved, lean in, ask the right questions. Who you vote for is important. What their policies are, are important as well. And so advocating for those structural changes. And I know some people out there may have heard that phrase, but I really appreciate it being brought back into this space, is apathy is the enemy of progress. This is not a space, since I've, kind of been here and really leaning into this work, I can tell there is not a lack of very passionate individuals on either side of this topic of homelessness, right? And so since we can, and if we can, continue to harness that energy to really help us make some structural impacts, that's a great place to be. David, my friend, do we have any questions to lift up to our panel?
Yes, let's, we got a few questions here. I'm not going to judge if they're softballs or hardballs. I'm just going to throw out a few of them. Going back to causes, individual causes, one thing we hear a lot is, all these homeless folks are not from here, or we want to make sure our social services aren't too great here for the homeless because it will attract homeless folks. I almost feel bad asking to such esteemed authors and a national campaign director to address this question, but this is brought up, and I think it's just the person was trying to highlight it for other people, obviously. So does place of origin play any role whatsoever in the experience of homelessness in our cities?
Yeah, I'll take that one because this is a personal passion of mine. And one of the things why I wanted to write this book is I will say when I'm in meetings in Seattle, this idea that we're a magnet for homelessness comes up in every single meeting. It is, whether we think it's a legitimate argument or not, we have to confront it because every community that I've been involved in believes that they're a magnet. And so this started when I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and everyone believed our homeless problem was because of people coming from Chicago. And we studied it and didn't find any evidence. And I moved to Seattle, and my first meeting, I said, well, we're a magnet for homelessness. I said, oh, that's interesting. And then I was in a meeting in California. I said, well, we're a magnet for homelessness. And then my favorite example, and actually Clay and I include this in the book, is a Washington Post article about Middletown, Ohio, that believes it's a magnet for homelessness. And so the point is that by definition, everyone can't be a magnet. And everyone believes that they are somehow attracting people because they maybe met someone on the street corner who is from a different jurisdiction. The evidence is overwhelming that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in a community are from that community. We look at mobility in our book and relationship to homelessness and find no evidence that there's disproportionate numbers of poor people moving to places with high rates of homelessness. We look at the generosity of federal welfare benefits and don't find that people are congregating in more generous states. We also know just from the housing literature that mobility, residential mobility, which is difficult. I always say I moved a family of 4 in 2017. Moving's hard. You're leaving family, friends. It's disruptive. You got to find a new place to live, new schools. Moving is hard in the best of circumstances. If you have zero resources and your only social network is in Seattle, are you really going to pick up and move to Topeka because the rents are cheaper? There is no data to suggest that that's going to happen. And we actually see that as income falls, residential mobility also falls because of the costs associated with that. And the lower your incomes, the social networks that you have become increasingly important. If your mom is the only person who can care for your child when you go to work, are you really going to move to a place with cheaper rents and lose that, essential social bond? And so the evidence is overwhelmingly on the side of those who don't who oppose that argument, yet that argument persists. And it's just something that we have to continue to confront and talk about.
I would also just briefly add, people move all the time, right? Regardless of housing status and regardless of income, people move all the time. And a lot of the time people move to cities, right? So I think in particular, when you ask this question, is a given city a quote unquote magnet? Is the population experiencing homelessness in a given city, majority in or out in terms of place of origin from that city? You also need to place those questions in the context of migration to a given region in the first place. And we use the Seattle example a lot because we both live here. But if you look at the workforce in Seattle, right, a lot of the people who work at Amazon didn't grow up in Seattle; they moved here. And so there's a natural question to be asked about the relationship between migratory trends writ large and this kind of place of origin notion. I don't think that you can disentangle homelessness, place of origin, and migration to a given metropolitan area.
Thank you for addressing that. I live in Frisco, Texas, which folks here in Dallas will know. 99% of people are not from here, and I never hear anybody complain about that. That seems to be a huge positive about Frisco, Texas. Okay, next question is from our good friend, Charlie O'Connell. He asks as follows. I'm just going to read it because this is a great question. Successful economic development drives worker and population growth, which drives housing cost and vacancy increases. I'm assuming he means vacancies, become more scarce. Therefore, don't chambers of commerce and their corporate members have to own part of the affordable housing solution? Again, anybody can take this.
Well, we write about this in the sense that one of my favorite quotes in the book is from Stephen Norman, who just retired as executive director of the King County Housing Authority. And he said that homes are where jobs go at night. And what we've done as economic development entities is we've tried to attract jobs. Every community in the country does this. And we talk about Amazon's HQ2 as an example of this, right? The fight to get all those jobs. And what happens is we give tax breaks and we do all sorts of things. We roll out the red carpet for employers to ensure that we have lots of high paid people in our community. And then we don't even think about where they're going to live. And the problem with, so the person asking the question is exactly right, in the sense that we focus on that side of it. And the problem is that the people moving to Seattle working for Amazon, they're going to find housing. Why? Because it's a market-based allocation system. If you have the resources, you're going to find it. It's the people who've been here for a long time now who don't have housing because we didn't think about accommodating the growth. And so I'm not opposed to economic growth and vitality. I don't think any mayor wants to stand up and say, my solution to homelessness is industrial decline, a la St. Louis, Cleveland, and Detroit, right? That's not a winning political strategy. And so I understand the need and the desire to have a robust economy and a growing labor market. We just have to keep our eye on the housing ball. You can't do one without the other. That's the issue.
All right, I'm gonna. This is a really good question. It from just because you guys, I mean, just a wealth of data, and so I'm interested. Dr. Leon Holman, one of our great activists here in Dallas, asks. This goes to the whole, what are not causes? Is there any data supporting the statement that homeless people will tear up the landlord's property? We have here in the state of Texas, source of income discrimination is legal. And often we hear that folks don't want to rent to homeless folks for a variety of reasons. And this Dr. Holman has heard this one before. So is there any data to support the fact that, the larger question of it's really not a great idea to rent your property to a person who's experiencing homelessness?
I'd be curious to hear Gregg's answer. I'm not aware of any data, right? Do do people experiencing homelessness tear up apartments any more than like college students who rent them? My guess would be no. But again, this is anecdotal. I don't have data in front of me. What I will say is that it's true that this anecdotal evidence, right? This notion that landlords are saying, no, I don't want to rent to, this person who's been sleeping outside. That's definitely a dynamic. So what do you do about that dynamic? Well, you can waive, the non-evidence I suggested in their face and say, well, I don't think that's true, but I don't actually have any evidence to back it up aside from my own experience. Or you can invest in what are called landlord liaison programs, and we've seen a lot of success in our region, in which you basically have a trusted source. Let's call it the continuum of care, or maybe it's a nonprofit housing provider, right? There's an institution that is serving, as basically a middleman who's vouching on behalf of a renter, and so the lease in question ideally is signed between the renter and the landlord. But if that's not on the table for whatever reason, if the landlord says, I'm just not going to do it, I'm only going to sign with someone I trust, then that's where these programs step in and say, we're going to vouch for this person. They've come through our program. I understand your concerns, but here's why you shouldn't have them. And in fact, you're going to sign that lease with me. I'm going to be in charge of ensuring that there's a responsible tenant in this space. I'm kind of on the line if anything goes wrong. So I think there are mechanisms in place for thinking through this dynamic. Greg, I don't know if you're aware of any evidence.
I haven't seen
Holman's question.
that. We hear about that a lot. I think it's fair to say that some tenants are harder on units than others. My parents just sold their house and are living in a rental unit, and they're probably pretty good tenants, right? They take care of their unit, and there are other people who are going to be harder on units. But I think isolating people experiencing homelessness, I think, is extremely problematic for a whole host of reasons. One is because I don't think there's necessarily evidence to suggest that they're more hard on units than others. I do think thinking about landlord relationships is essential when we think about the housing voucher program. There's been a lot of good research on that in terms of what can we do to provide supports to landlords such that it makes it easier for them to lease to voucher tenants. Absolutely essential and critical. And as housing markets get tighter, those supports for landlords become increasingly important because they have other options. And I say this all the time, in Seattle, it's incredibly hard for voucher holders to find a unit because there aren't any units out there. And if you're a landlord saying, I can rent this unit to an Amazon employee who's going to pay market rents, or I can engage with the government, go through a government inspection, have all this paperwork, why wouldn't I do the other? It doesn't necessarily need to be discriminatory to say, I'm just making a rational decision, business decision to say, this is easier for me. And so, and this gets to that scarcity of housing. When we have scarce housing, it forces those decisions on landlords, and sometimes they can be really have huge consequences, but they might be a relatively rational decision that they're making. So it's complicated.
Yeah, I would just, the one sort of additional layer here is sometimes when you hear this argument of that they're disproportionately likely to destroy property or whatever. First of all, there is no evidence that I'm aware of that, but also it's code for other things. Mm-hmm. It's code for, a lot of times if they do accept Section 8, they're worried that it will deter market rate renters from the property. And there, I think it's really important to point to, complexes that do accept vouchers, even in really high opportunity, expensive areas that are full. They haven't deterred market rate renters. So I think it's important to point to those proof points that, just by virtue of accepting Section 8 vouchers, it's not a deterrent for those who are able to pay market rent. So I think a lot of times it goes back to the engagement question, where sometimes that's the first thing that you'll hear out of a landlord's mouth or an apartment association's mouth, but it really requires further conversation to really figure out what they're getting at, because oftentimes that's not actually the issue that they're worried about.
I love how comprehensive putting all of your answers together really was, and especially the fact that we really do have to weigh carefully how much are we going to engage in a discussion, to dispel these things, which sometimes has its place. And so, and a lot of times what we need to do is what we're doing at MDHA and in the COC here in Dallas is we just invest in landlord relationships. We invest in landlord incentives. So kind of getting, getting around the problem, okay, I'm not going to argue. Okay, let's say you think that's true. How much damage do you think it could be? Okay, here's $1,000, just to kind of, tide you over and make sure you don't worry about that. And a lot of times landlords would be like, great, that's cool. Now I'm cool with moving ahead. And then, hopefully through the experience, they see like, oh yeah, this is actually cool. This works. Okay, here, something that, again, I'm kind of reading the questions and relating it to stuff that we've seen in the news. I don't know how many have used, so the question from Nazia Hussein is, what roles have HOAs played in homelessness? And we've had in the news here one HOA who kind of has been publicized as playing a very counterproductive role, and we've had other examples of that. But in general, when you're looking at the evidence and nationwide, what have you guys seen?
And so the question is about homeowners associations and what role they play. That's the question.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that I've seen specific research on HOAs and homelessness. I do know that HOAs have had a significant role in discrimination and segregation in housing markets and access to housing. And so I know that broadly there's a strong relationship there, and basic intuition would suggest that obviously filters down to homelessness as well. And so exclusionary practices imposed and enacted by HOAs clearly have a detrimental impact on people who are trying to get housing. There's just no doubt about that. I'd be curious if Mike or Clay have other thoughts on that.
I'm also not aware of any evidence off the top of my head, but I think what Greg said about any exclusionary practices in housing markets necessarily being related upstream to homelessness is kind of a no-brainer, right? And aside from like exclusion and discrimination, there's also just a question of control, and I think like when we talk about effective responses to homelessness, right? When we think about like housing first approaches or like a coordinated entry program, or like a diversion program that's responsive to people's needs when they come, to the front door of a crisis response system, like common shared factors about these successful models are that there's a lack of an imposition of control. Right, you're taking people's needs at face value and listening to what it is that will help them, and then providing that thing, and that kind of runs counter, right? Just the ethos generally of a successful crisis response system runs counter to this notion of control.
Yeah, I'm not aware either of any robust research around HOAs, but I think broadly speaking, there's there's a challenge here with just home ownership in general, that frankly they benefit when housing is scarce. There's just, their property values go up when supply is low, and so there's sort of a baked-in incentive to be a NIMBY about it, right? Because your property values are linked to that. So I think given that just basic financial reality, that there is, there's a property value interest, and at least people think there is in terms of being a NIMBY. I think it's important to talk about the other costs, and this goes back to the earlier conversation that we were having of the other costs that homeowners are incurring, that they might not see it on their property tax bill, but they are incurring these costs nonetheless because we have failed to solve this problem. Lower educational achievement, right? There's all sorts of remediation programs that we have to do in school districts because kids are experiencing housing instability or homelessness. There's a cost to that, right? And that schools are funded through property taxes. There are health impacts. There are court impacts. Traffic. I mean, right, one of the reasons why traffic is so bad in major cities is because they've had to sprawl out, and people have to live so far away from where the jobs are to get an affordable place to live, and that's clogging up our freeways. So the reason you're sitting in traffic for a half hour more every day is because we can't solve the damn housing crisis. So I think you got to quantify it to people in potentially other ways. And I think particularly for homeowners that there are these invisible costs that they are paying that they might not be aware of. And I think it's really important to frame that to them. But it is a hard conversation with homeowners who think that, you know, they're financially benefiting from the lack of housing. To some extent, they're right. But we have to convince them that there are significant other costs that they're paying, in addition to the moral implications of it as well, right? There's also the moral stuff here. People need a place to live. So.
Beautiful. And that, you know, the final question I was going to ask you to address was that one, and you just did it, is that, you know, reminding people, you know, how do we remind people of the other costs that are out there? And I think, you know, you said there's the moral side, but I really think what this book really drove home to me, like other books that I've read, like say the end of How to Be an Anti-Racist, is benign self-interest. You know, like the as you guys said, you know, this is homelessness in Austin, the housing in Austin. Homelessness anywhere is really the canary in the coal mine, right? And if you don't think that this problem is coming for you in the middle class, then it is coming for you. And so even if you did not care about the moral aspect of it, certainly the benign self-interest, watching your rent go up, your mortgage go up, you know, would induce you to do something. I am going to hand it back to Jolie to close us out. Our fearless leader. Jolie, take it away.
I am just in love with this conversation. You know, all the texts have been going back and forth with just how rich and full today's conversation was. And it's digestible, right? So even how you all led us through the book that you wrote was really super powerful and really lands. And so, you know, just thank you for joining us today. Our next hard conversation MDHA is hosting is in late August. We're discussing another book. The name of that book is In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It. And we'll have those authors on. That conversation will be facilitated by Ashley Brundage of United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. She's the chair of our Homeless Collaborative of Dallas and Collin County. At MDHA in the community, we'll be doing a read along of that book, discussing it on social media. So please join us. I really appreciate all of our panelists. Mike, thank you for moderating. Clayton and Greg, thank you for joining us today for this conversation and for the work that you all continue to do. I wish everyone well out there. Thank you all for joining, watching, and or listening, or wherever you are in your spaces. Thank you for continuing to lean in and advocate for this work and do the work that you all are doing. I wish you all well. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Jolie. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Jolie.